So one of the nice things about being here is that you can speak about what you actually believe, and you can be among people that you don't have to sort of silence and censor yourself around. And I'm going to speak about one of those controversial topics that you might find yourself self-censoring on. This is the subject of conversion therapy, or the attempts to ban what is always so-called conversion therapy. And that's because conversion therapy is a complete misnomer. It has nothing to do with therapy. It's not something they're talking about, that there are psychologists or counselors or those things that if you Googled and looked for a conversion therapist in Scotland, you wouldn't find that term, anybody advertising those services under that name. So what the BBC says conversion therapy means, it refers to any form of treatment or psychotherapy which aims to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, ranging from electric shock treatment to religious teaching or discussion. Now, the electric shock treatment is a bit of a straw man argument, because though it might have been used like in the 60s or something when they'd just discovered that you could do things by sticking electrodes on people's brains, it's not something which has been used in the UK for homosexuality or anything like that in sort of like decades and decades and decades. So really, these laws are all focused around the issues of discussion and prayer and moral objections and religious teaching. But it's not just religious people who are affected by this. So J.K. Rowling's, that's her handprints in the ground, and the trans activists have put red paint there, indicating that she is guilty of the blood of trans people because she believes that there should be spaces for women who've been abused where no men are allowed to go, no biological men are allowed to go. Richard Dawkins, again, maybe not particularly religious, but he lost his Humanist of the Year award title. He got it in 1996, and it was stripped away from him because as a biologist, he believed that sex had more to do with chromosomes than what was going on inside people's brains. And then you had Joanna Cherry, so the SNP MSP, and she's a feminist. And so, like, feminism needs a fairly robust definition of gender in order to define what it is that you think is great about feminism. And so, she says a woman is an adult human female, taking that definition from the dictionary, and she says for that she lost her position within the SNP. So when we think about conversion therapy, one really important question is where does our idea of sexuality come from? What does sexuality really mean? And there was a massive study done by a company called 23andMe, and this is a company which Google have invested in. I think actually one of the founders of Google was either married to or going out with the founder of this company, and so there was some investment in there from them. And Silicon Valley and Google are not very socially conservative, so this is not a very biased study from that perspective. But this is what the Scientific American said that study found. So it says, few aspects of human biology are as complex or politically fraught as sexual orientation. A clear genetic link would suggest that gay people are born this way, as opposed to having made a lifestyle choice. Yet some fear that such a finding could be misused to cure homosexuality, and most research teams have shied away from tackling this topic. So they're afraid of what they might find if they do the research. But Google wasn't afraid, or 23andMe wasn't afraid. Now a new study claims to dispel the notion that a single gene or handful of genes makes a person prone to same-sex behavior. The analysis, which examined the genomes of nearly 500,000 men and women, found that although genetics are certainly involved in who people choose to have sex with, there are no specific genetic predictors. The actual thing that they found was that the single biggest contributor in terms of genetically could contribute about 1% to what might make somebody have same-sex attraction. All the contributing factors put together in terms of genetics, they thought was maybe between 8 and about 23%. And so one geneticist looking at these findings, he said, this is the end of the gay gene. And so basically, if you were there in the 80s and 90s, the gay gene had been discovered about 30 times, and the reason it kept being discovered is that every time it was discovered, it was refuted that it had actually been found. So you saw all the headlines, and then they were proved to be false. But what is the Scottish government suggesting that kindergarten children should be taught? Well, they should be colouring in pictures of Lady Gaga, and beside it, it's got the phrase, "You were born this way." And so we have something that the scientists know isn't right, and yet we are teaching the exact opposite in our schools. Now, as well as a scientific perspective, there's also a religious perspective. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are sometimes called the Islamic faiths. They make up about 55% of the world's population. Now, Abraham had a nephew called Lot, and he lived in the city of Sodom. And we're told in the scriptures that in that city, all the men in that city turned up at the door of Lot and demanded to have sex with the men that were living under his roof. And we're also told that these same men refused to have sex with women. And so logically, from the scripture's perspective, it means that if homosexuality was genetic, then these men's dads would have also been homosexual, and therefore they would have refused sex with their mothers, and therefore they would never have been born. And so the thinking behind these faiths really doesn't lend itself to this idea that sexuality is something that is written into you before that you're born. LGBT lobby groups tend to see sexual desire not like other desires, like the desire to eat. Now, we all have the desire to eat, and it's something good, but we have to control that. If we don't control that, we'll be obese or we'll have some other issues. They maybe see the sexual desire more like a powerful pagan god whose demands must be obeyed if the villagers want to keep their minds and their sanity and their lives. When I was young, I played a game called Lemmings, and the idea of Lemmings was that you had to guide these little lemmings safely to their home, and to do that you would have to bash through different rocks and things like that to get them home. But there were certain rocks that had arrows on them, and that meant that you could only bash through them in one direction. And that's what we're seeing in our society, is this one-way system where everyone is forced to promote the pro-LGBT, pro-trans agenda, and any attempts to push in the other way are basically being made illegal. So you probably saw this on the Family Party's recent YouTube videos. This is a school in Edinburgh that basically asked all of the pupils, whether they're male or female, whether they're transsexual or not, to put on skirts for the day. And that included the staff, and it included the pupils. And what some of the pupils say, you maybe can see the signs they're holding up. One of them is saying, "It feels odd because I never wore a skirt. This child never had any inclination to put on a skirt, but I feel amazing." The other one says, "I feel comfortable in my skirt. It feels nice." And then the teacher is saying, "I am so proud of our P6 students who've done this." And so the students get all this affirmation for doing that. Is it the skirt that feels nice, or is it the affirmation that feels so great? So as the Scottish Family Party, we've done a lot of looking into the government's rshp.scot website. And this is the guide which is there for teachers to tell them how to teach sex education in Scottish schools. And right throughout it, there is this promotion of homosexuality and transgenderism. And so you see these two boys, who apparently are in love in primary school. And then when it comes to teaching about sex, 2/3 of the material is always homosexual. So they present a lesbian couple, a gay couple, and maybe a straight couple. And so here, the description of sex It tells primary school students how to have sex, and it tells them 3 times how nice it feels. This is primary school age 9 to 11 pupils. But it introduces it first with a lesbian couple, then with what appears to be a straight couple, and then with what appears to be a gay couple. But if you look at these pictures closely, you will actually see that the man who's sleeping with the woman, it's actually one of the women from the lesbian couple. And if you look at the man who's sleeping with the man, there's something a bit suspicious about him. He doesn't look quite maybe as you'd expect. His legs look a little bit different. Oh, actually, he's got the same outline as the other lesbian. There is actually the other lesbian has transitioned to become a man, and the same man has slept with both of these lesbian women stroke men, depending on how you look at it. And you may be thinking, well, that's not the aspiration that I have for my child. You may be thinking, I'm going to take my child out of these relationship education lessons. But thankfully, the Scottish Government have anticipated that, and they are going to stop you from doing that by having pro-LGBT material in every lesson. And so this is how you might teach children to pledge their allegiance to the flag in maths. So they have the LGBT flag, and children are asked to measure its dimensions, work out its areas, work out the circumference, and admire the general beauty of it. As you go into secondary school, it's not enough to teach homosexuality alongside heterosexuality. You have to make the case that homosexuality is actually better than heterosexuality, that heterosexuality is actually kind of just a bit inferior, obviously. And so they come up with stats like this, that lesbians have 12% more orgasms, and then for gay sex they say anal penetration can stimulate the glandular organ known as the prostate. Though there's no published laboratory research, anecdotal evidence suggests that prostate orgasms are more powerful and pleasurable than penal-induced ones. We don't have the evidence, but we've got the agenda, and we'd like you to go along with it. And so homosexuality is actually very wonderful, and transgenderism is wonderful, and we'd love everybody to celebrate it and be proud of it. But however, when you scratch beneath the surface, you find out that people aren't enjoying their lives twice as much or 12% more. LGBT youths are twice as likely to contemplate suicide, a survey finds. 1 in 7 sexually active gay men in London lives with HIV, including over 4,000 people who don't know that they have the virus. So if 2 gay men in London slept together, there's about a 1 in 4 chance that one of them would be HIV positive. And is that the aspiration that we should have for young people to be involved in these relationships? The Terence Higgins Trust in 2016, they estimated that each HIV positive case will cost the NHS about £360,000 is the lifetime cost of each case. London gay men make up 2% of its population, yet a quarter of the sexually transmitted infections and half of HIV infections. And then in terms of lesbianism, there is a higher incidence of breast cancer, and this probably comes from them being less likely to have children, which so childless couples would have the same kind of things that could happen there. And so what's happening here is homosexuality is it something which is built into us when we're born? And there's been a recent study by YouGov, and they've been surveying people of different age groups and asking them about their sexuality. And so they asked them to say, where are you on a scale of 0 to 6, where 0 is I'm entirely heterosexual and 6 is that I'm entirely homosexual. Where would you place yourself on that spectrum. And they found out that about half of young people now put themselves in the not entirely heterosexual category. And you can see how that changes with the age groups. So in this graph, we see that 72% of those of all ages said they were entirely heterosexual in this study. But among the 18 to 24-year-olds, that falls to 46%. So there's an incredible change which is happening with the generations. Again, we see this with bisexuality, that 43% of the respondents who were 18 to 24 said they were bisexual to some degree. So that was that they were between 1 and 5 on this scale. But when you go up to those over 60, it's 7%. And so there must be something other than the way that people are born which is influencing people's sexuality. Have you got 3 choices? Choice number 1, old people are liars. Maybe. Choice number 2, that as people grow older, their sexuality changes and they become more conservative the older that they get. Or choice number 3, that the promotion of homosexuality in schools and the promotion of this that we see in culture is actually having an effect on the decisions that people make. We see something similar within transgenderism. This is Krista Bell, and she has been fighting a case in the courts against the Tavistock Clinic. She started puberty blockers at the age of 16. Then for 4 years she had cross-sex hormones, during which she underwent a double mastectomy and both of her breasts were removed. There's an amazing interview on the BBC, and these are the questions that she was asked. As a teenager, how strongly did you feel the need to physically change? Her answer, I didn't feel too strongly until I looked into how the process went with every case. I found out how that was through the internet. I just felt like each step, I consistently felt the need to change more in order to feel better, because each step, it didn't really make me feel better as I went along, looking back on it. I think I should have been challenged on the proposals and claims I was making for myself. There will be young people who say going to the clinic saved their lives. What would you say to that? I did say the same thing years ago when I went to the clinic. I felt like it was saving me from suicidal ideation and just depression in general. And at the time, I felt it relieved those mental health conditions I was struggling with. What would you say to your 16-year-old self now? Well, I feel like I could say anything and I wouldn't listen. And that's kind of the point of this case, that when you're young, you don't really want to listen to anyone. It's up to the institutions to step in and make the children reconsider what they are saying, because it's a life-altering path you're going on. I feel angry that no one was really there to say anything different, and I was allowed to run with this idea that I had, or, almost like a fantasy. I'm very young. I've only just stepped into adulthood, and I have to deal with this burden or this radical difference to other people. How do you identify now? I'm accepting of my sex, which is female, and just taking each day as it comes. So she actually won her case, and in, I believe, England and Wales, it now means that puberty blockers cannot be given to those who are under 16 unless there's a specific court order allowing it in their case. The Tavistock and Portman trusts, they tried to hide the statistics on the number of people that were progressing from puberty blockers to the cross-sex treatment. They had argued that puberty blockers were just something that bought people time to think. But the judges refuted that. The judges rejected the argument, saying, in our view, this does not reflect reality. The evidence shows that the vast majority of children, that's 98% of those who take puberty blockers, move on to take cross-sex hormones, and that these are part of one clinical pathway. So you start on one, you're going to move to the other. Now, for Christabel, that pathway, it started when she was 14, discovering these things online. But now we're bringing this into primary schools and introducing these ideologies to children in the very earliest stages of school. What was going on inside that gender clinic? Well, the concerns of staff were ignored. There were 35 resignations from people inside who couldn't believe what was happening inside of this gender clinic. There was this lady who was acting as a whistleblower, that her job was to safeguard children, and as she raised her concerns, she got bullied, and she was constructively dismissed. And she won her case, and she got £20,000 worth of damage. Now, if you can see the people at the very heart of these transgender clinics, if they're ringing alarm bells, and yet they're not able to bring that change in these clinics, it tells you that there's a very powerful motivation behind this sort of agenda. Now, on the BBC, they often have double standards, because they look at Hong Kong and they say, because we're pro-democracy as a country, they look at what's happening there and they say, this is terrible. And so, looking at Hong Kong, they said that people who are pro-democracy, their neighbours are being invited to snitch on them to the Communist Party. And they think, this is something terrible which is happening. But the same thing is happening in Scotland. The Scottish government is posting these adverts on Twitter. Dear transphobes, we have a phobia of your hatred, yours, Scotland. Now, what transphobia means is anything you want it to mean. It can mean somebody who is being attacked, physically assaulted, left with a bloody nose or something like that, of which the family party would think this is horrendous and this needs to be dealt with and can be dealt with under current laws. But what's also included in that is anybody who doesn't agree with transgenderism. And so people are invited to report these cases of transphobia to the police. And because its adverts are going out saying, please report it, obviously the stats are going up for transphobic incidents. And so they're saying, call 101 or call 999 if you have an incident of that. But thankfully, the police will be reasonable within these matters, and we can count on them to be impartial. In Canada, what happened was that a father was jailed for speaking out against his biological daughter's gender transition. So the family is split up, and the wife was pushing the child towards a gender transition, and the father didn't agree with that, and he began to oppose that, and because of that, he faced jail. We saw Bernard Randall, and he was been on our Scottish Family Party live stream. He was in a school, and the school had diversity training there. And as part of that diversity training, he was asked to shout, "Smash heteronormativity." Now, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are heteronormative. This is what Jesus said. He said, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason, the man, who is the male that we learned about earlier, will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, which is the female that we learned about earlier, and the two will become one flesh." And so there we have gender and sex being seen as synonymous within Christianity, and heterosexual relationships being portrayed as the normal. And so, smashing Judaism, smashing Christianity, that doesn't sound super tolerant. Edinburgh Council, that when Destiny Church wanted to hire out the Usher Hall for their conference, they denied them the ability to do that because they went back online, they looked through all of the speakers that they had, and they found one speaker who'd made a comment about homosexuality, basically outlining Christian beliefs on the subject, not saying anything that would be super controversial within Christian circles. And said, because of this, you can't have our venue, even though the convent had nothing to do with sexuality or anything like that. And Edinburgh Council lost the case. But now this call for the ban on conversion therapy is coming in to the Scottish Parliament. And it's fairly vitriolic against religion. And so this is Dr. Rebecca Crowther. And here she says, even prayer, there is this idea that prayer is lesser than electric shock therapy. But it can lead to acute mental health problems and suicidal ideation. So it's all as harmful. Then, she might sound like she's a bit intolerant of religion here. So she backs herself up and tries to appear that she's actually friendly towards faith. So she says, nor is it inclusive, that's conversion therapy, of conversion to Christianity or any other faith. So don't worry, Christians, you're safe with her. She's got your back covered. As long as this conversion isn't trying to encourage changing or suppressing one's sexual orientation. So if anyone, is being encouraged to be celibate or any of those things, then that would count as conversion therapy. And so what she's effectively saying, I'm happy for you to be Christians as long as I, and not Jesus Christ, get to define what Christianity is. So, which is a bit of a veiled claim to be the Messiah, I think. So what it says within the Bible is, do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor male prostitutes, nor homosexual offenders, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And that is what some of you were. So the claim that these texts, the religious text is making, is that change is possible for people. And that's actually the very essence of Christianity. Jesus' message was repent, which means change, because the kingdom of God is near. And, when Jesus was being born, the message that was given to her mother was, you shall call him Jesus, because he will save people from their sins. And so the essence of what this doctor is saying is that Christians should not be allowed to teach that Jesus can help people who are being tempted. In fact, what this kind of definition of conversion therapy means is it basically makes Christianity illegal. It's the first thing, I think, the first step we've seen taken by government that makes traditional Christianity illegal. And I would encourage you to speak, if you're a Christian, speak to your pastor, speak to your leader. If you're a Muslim, I'm sure there's similar issues within your faith. In Judaism as well, you'll find similar issues there. Then we have this fellow here. He says that conversion therapy cannot work. You cannot change sexuality or gender. Now, I'd agree that you can't change gender. I don't think he's meaning the same thing as me, because people are always transitioning and transitioning back. There are what are described as gender-fluid people, and there are also people within the LGBTQIA camp that would describe themselves as bisexual, gender-fluid, these kind of things. So that's actually built into their own philosophy. And as we saw from the figures earlier, the majority of the people in the LGBTQ spectrum were somewhere on that bisexual spectrum, somewhere between homosexual and heterosexual, and so have at least some kind of ability to make decisions about what desires they decide to pursue and which ones they do not. And then he goes on to say, again, that said, people cannot consent to torture. So the argument is sometimes made by people that conversion therapy happens among consenting people. And he's saying, but you can't consent to torture. This amounts to torture. So he's up the ante here. So we're now like in the Hague court of human rights, along with the mass murderers and the genocides and all these kind of things. We've got that kind of blood on our hands. And what we're dealing with is like torture, which is one of those crimes against humanity. And all that may have happened is that somebody may have gone to a pastor in church, and this may be somebody who's sent from an LGBT plus organization. Hi, I'm struggling with sexual temptation. I have homosexual desires. Please, could you pray with me about that temptation? And the pastor just prays and says, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Lead us not into temptation. And by simply praying that, he's been praying for a change to occur which suppresses this person's sexuality. And this person could then find themselves in trouble with the law. So you're saying, what? Are you expecting some kind of LGBTQ inquisition? Maybe. It could happen. Well, you might expect with all this hyperbole that the MSPs would kind of see through it and bring these claims back into check. But this is what the MSP says, responding to this. He said, well, you said, you can't consent to torture. That has to be the quote of the session. So he's like 100% on board that anybody who is praying, discussing any of these things in these areas, that they are a torturer, war criminal kind of thing. So as the Scottish Family Party, we oppose the ban on conversion therapy. We uphold the value of freedom of religion. We uphold the value of freedom of speech. We oppose LGBTQ inclusive education that mandates that this radical ideology of sexuality being taught in schools. We oppose transgender ideologies being imposed in schools and inside workplaces. Thank you very much.